And we're going to share and get into the next notes. This is a lot briefer. This only has what, 23 slides, so that's always appreciated. All right, so now we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, these nerves and different reflexes. And this will also include, different types of receptors and what they do. Right? So now we're in the peripheral nervous system. Right? And we were somewhat, we were talking about the spinal cord before, but now we're going to try a little farther away. Remember, sensory in, motor out. The single motor neuron chain is to the somatic division, which is skeletal muscle. And then we have a 2-neuron chain as part of the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. All right, so sensory receptors. So we need to talk about that. Specialized receptors, just like we said that in the skin when we looked at free nerve endings, Meissner's corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles, they're specialized nerve structures, quote unquote. They're not cells, really. There's a type of a structure that respond to changes in the stimulus. All right, most people get that. Because when it comes to special senses, we're going to have actually cells that act like a receptor. It's not going to be really a nerve structure, but these are like what we call specialized nerve structures. They end up generating the graded potentials that trigger the action potentials in the sensory neuron. As long as you stimulate that receptor enough, it will generate a signal in the sensory neuron, and the sensory neuron carries it to the central nervous system so you perceive it. Generally, one sensory neuron only carries information for one particular sensation. And generally, but there are exceptions, one receptor responds to only one thing, either as it acts as either a chemoreceptor or a mechanoreceptor, or a photoreceptor. All right, so the receptors are named for the different stimuli they detect. Right? So mechanoreceptors, that's the Pacinian Meissner's corpuscles. They respond to touch, pressure, squashing, stretch, some kind of physical deformation, maybe bending a hair. Something is physically, mechanically happening. I'm just kind of throttling something, moving it, shaking it. Right? Thermoreceptors respond to temperature changes. Photoreceptors respond to light energy, like found in the retina. Chemoreceptors respond to different chemicals in aqueous solution, suspended in water. We have them, we have chemoreceptors in the tongue and in areas of the throat for taste. We have them lining your nasal cavities in certain areas for smell. We have chemoreceptors within blood vessels. We're going to see that when we look at the different cranial nerves. Nociceptors respond to pain. Nociception is pain. And baroreceptors respond to a particular, they are somewhat in the category of mechanoreceptors because something is physically occurring, but baroreceptors respond to pressure and are found, within the pressure, respond to pressure within the blood vessels being stretched or not stretched, and therefore, they will have a certain pattern. Well, we'll get to that in AMP2, but there's a certain pattern of signals that they send to let your body know whether you're in appropriate pressure, blood pressure, or if it's too high or too low. So they respond to the degree of pressure, exerted against the vessel wall due to, the left ventricle pumping blood into circulation, and therefore that pressure stretches or does not stretch, so to speak, the walls of those blood vessels and arteries. So they're found in blood vessels, especially the carotid arteries and the aortic arch. This will become relevant when we look at the cranial nerves. Right, so location, if they're closer to the respond to stimuli outside the body, and near to the body's surface, so near to, then they're called exteroreceptors. They often include touch, pressure, pain, temperature, the special senses, all right, like that free nerve ending, all right. Interoreceptors respond to stimuli that's originating inside of the body, like those baroreceptors. These are just the locations of them. Right? And then proprioceptors monitor stretching of skeletal muscles and joints in joint compression, for body movement and awareness. Right, nerve coverings. Well, just like muscles, we have 3 connective tissue layers. We have the epineurium. So look, make sure when you're getting these quiz questions and exam questions, you're reading all these terms. If we're talking about nerve coverings, we're talking about the epineurium surrounds the entire nerve, perineurium surrounds a fascicle, and endoneurium surrounds one axon, one fiber. Right. Same type of organization as muscles, but muscles are epimysium, paramysium, endomysium. Make sure you recognize that. Okay. All right, so this we have slides in downstairs that are really good with identifying these different connective tissue layers. And it's kind of location, location, location. If it's a connective tissue layer that's capable of going around this entire large bundle of nerves you're looking at, it's to the outer region circumferentially, it's an epineurium. And then you can see little clusters. Sometimes you only have two fascicles. Well, the connective tissue layer that could only go around one fascicle, would be the perineurium. And then anything within one fascicle would have to be an endoneurium. And when you look at the slides of this, the outer part, is kind of a white staining, and the actually the outer part is kind of black, and then you have a clear region because the connective tissue will take up some stain. The fat really doesn't take up stain, but the axon in the center, you might see a little dot, and it kind of looks like macaronis on end, with then like maybe a little dot in the center, and then you're looking at an endoneurium, and in the interior would be the axon. The region between the axon and the endoneurium would be that fatty myelin sheath. So when we magnify this picture up on the top, if we can magnify it a little bit more, when we're in this one fascicle, let's say, you can see the brown walls and then like the black kind of interior. The slides downstairs, or the ones that you look at, are going to have different coloring. The endoneurium is the light brown, kind of looks like kind of macaronis on end here. And then the interior is the black area. Well, in the slides, the outer connective, that endoneurium will be black, and then the interior is rather clear. Every once in a while, you can see a little black dot because the nerve is traveling just right where, now the nerve, the axon is taken up stain, and you can maybe see a little axon right in the interior. Okay, well, we know we have 2 different nerve types. We have sensory nerves and motor nerves. We have some interneurons as well, but they still are of the shape of either a unipolar, a bipolar, or a multipolar. Sensory nerves carry impulses to the CNS. Motor nerves carry impulses away from the CNS. The nerves in the peripheral nervous system, again, we have cranial nerves and spinal nerves. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves, or mixed nerves. Nerves are named for where they emerge from the spinal cord. Thus, they will often refer to as the C1 nerve, or the C2, C3, C4, C5, depending on where it's originating and exiting from the spinal column. All right, so we're going to talk about the cranial nerves. This might be a little more information, and specificity than what you're going to get in lab. It just depends on whether they're using the lab book that we use here, or whether they're using, one of the other kind of expensive lab book, that Ammerman lab book. But in any event, you need to be able to identify the different cranial nerves, which are numbered 1 through 12, but with Roman numerals. So there's going to be a lot of repetition and practice to this, you guys. I would start with, and if you don't have one of those whiteboards, a great big whiteboard, this is the time to buy it. Because you start by maybe listing 1 through 6, and what are the names of those nerves, and then 7 through 12, 1 through 6, 7 to 12, and then you do 1 through 12. And you have to know the names of them first, and then you're going to add another layer to it. So there are plenty of mnemonics out there that you can, write out the mnemonic that helps keeps these nerves in order like this. And they're always by Roman numerals. So some of the models have them with just the Roman numerals on them. Okay, so after we go through all this, there's ways of kind of bundling these together. For instance, when you start memorizing, their sensory or motor or both functions, you're gonna, after you pass through this a few times, you're gonna start brain dumping this really quick. And you're gonna go, okay, out of these 12, I've named them all. I have a list of my 12 cranial nerves. And then maybe you have next to the names of each one, you have a column for sensory functions and then further motor functions. And then you start writing them in, to the left or to the right, of a particular cranial nerve. And that's the best way to do this. And you keep creating this one big chart and you practice it over and over and over again. And I'll just tell you that the fastest way to do this is to start with the first two nerves and the last two nerves, because out of these 12, the first two nerves are sensory only, and the last two nerves are motor only. Then 3, 4, and 6, oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens are associated with eye movement. You don't have to know the particular muscle right now, but you will by the time we get to special senses. So right now, those 3 are just associated really with muscle, motor to the muscles of the eyes or eye movement, with the exception of oculomotor has a couple other little things in there. And then we get to trigeminal, which is our first major mixed nerve that has really sensory and motor functions associated with it. Now, I will tell you also that some of these nerves that we're looking at just maybe motor only functions, some instructors, and technically these cranial nerves also convey a certain amount of sensory information, proprioceptive information, because of the degree of contraction of these eye muscles gives your brain an idea of where your body is in space and where your eyes are, in your eye sockets. But because they're not testable really, and that we just generally don't talk about those proprioceptive functions, but I will say that if your lab instructor does include those, which, is entirely up to them, it's real minutia. That's, then they're not technically incorrect. It's just that I'm not going to test you on that, because there's enough in here that is associated with the things you can test with different reflexes that you do need to know when you perform a gag, reflex on someone, because that is part of your head and neck and physical assessment, your cranial nerve assessment. The proprioceptive portions of these things, no, you just can't isolate those. Okay, so let's talk about our first 6 cranial nerves. First nerve is olfactory nerve. That's this associated with smell, or conveys a special sense of smell. And that's all it conveys, right? So that's cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 conveys the sense for vision, right? So visual sensation, not that hard, right? Olfactory is just above, the olfactory nerves pass through the olfactory foramina of the ethmoid bone, and then hang down and line the interior of your nose. Right? The optic nerves travel from the back of your eyeballs, right? And they cross in the center of the optic chiasm. All right, the third cranial nerve is oculomotor. It will be the innervation to 4 of 6 muscles that attach to the eye. They're called the extrinsic muscles of the eye, but you have 6 muscles that can, connect to the eye, and they very meticulously move your eye around the orbit of the eye. Oculomotor innervates the majority of them, 4 of them. They also innervate the circular muscles in your iris when it constricts, we have pupillary constriction. It lets less light in. It's going to be associated with the parasympathetic division. It stimulates some of the muscles to your eyelids and muscles to the lens. So you don't know what the lens is yet, but we'll see that when we get to the eyes. Okay, then we have, so 3, 4, and 6 kind of go in the same category of those are the only cranial nerves that innervate any of those extrinsic muscles of the eye. So trochlear, right now, we're just going to say it's motor to some of those eye muscles. We'll come back and identify specifically what those are when we look at the anatomy of the eye. And then we're just going to skip 5 for a moment and go down to 6, abducens. It too is motor to eye muscles. Right. So right now it's fairly simple and straightforward. All right. Even 5 and 7, what we're going to talk about, are a little more complicated, but we'll come back and do everything maybe except for 9 and 10, glossopharyngeal and vagus, and then we'll kind of put those together. All right, so trigeminal. It's a large nerve that has 3 branches to it. It's on the medial lateral aspect, or the lateral mid-pons lateral aspect, I should say, on the inferior surface of the brain models. All these are going to be identified in the undersurface, the inferior aspect of your brain models. Right, it's the largest cranial nerve. So its sensory function is to the skin of the face, right? And motor is to muscles of mastication. The 2 muscles that you already know associated with chewing are the masseter and temporalis. So don't be surprised if in lab, or even, I ask you a question like, which cranial nerve, supplies the masseter muscle or temporalis muscle? Well, those are chewing muscles, that's what mastication means. So the answer would be trigeminal. All right, so trigeminal is the first truly mixed nerve. It conveys to the central nervous system, sensation like touch, pain, and temperature from the skin of the face, right, to the central nervous system, and motor to muscles of mastication, masseter and temporalis. Okay, then we go to facial nerve, because we said 6 is abducens. Right now, it's just eye muscles. 7 is the facial nerve. All right, now not to be confused with facial sensation of trigeminal. So the facial nerve is cranial nerve 7. It conveys, in the sensory component, taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Taste is very complicated. Taste is going to be conveyed on 3 cranial nerves, 7, 9, and 10. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, the majority of the tongue, that the sensation of taste is going to be conveyed on the facial nerve. The motor component are muscles of facial expression, like the zygomaticus muscle, also to salivary and lacrimal glands, right? Salivary glands and lacrimal glands. Lacrimal glands produce tears associated with crying. Salivary glands are associated with digestion. Okay, now we're going to go on to vestibular cochlear. This is a pretty easy one too. This nerve conveys sensation of hearing and balance, kind of equilibrium. When we look at the ear models, this will be the difference between the cochlea that looks like a snail shell that contains your hearing receptors, and the semicircular canals or the vestibular apparatus are these 3 fluid-filled hoops traveling in different directions from one another, and that structure is associated with balance and equilibrium, and circular, rotational, and linear movement. So that has a lot to do with how fast you're moving. Am I spinning around? Am I going up elevator, down elevator, type of a thing. So hearing and balance mean equilibrium from the vestibular cochlear nerve. I'm going to move on. I'm going to skip 9 and 10 right now, you guys, because I'm going to come back to it because there's a lot in there. We said the first 2 nerves were sensory only. The last 2 nerves are motor only. Right? So that makes them pretty easy. Cranial nerve 11 is called accessory or spinal accessory nerve. And that is motor to sternocleidomastoid and trapezius. They produce movement of the head and the shoulders. So now you know what is sternocleidomastoid, right? That muscle originates in the sternum and the clavicle, travels to the mastoid process. So it's found that big muscle on the right and left, in the anterior aspect of your throat or neck area. And trapezius is that big kite-shaped kind of superficial muscle of the upper back and part of the lower back. So the specific cranial nerve that innervates those 2 muscles is accessory. And then we have hypoglossal. So hypo means below, and we have tongue. Right? So cranial nerve 12 is hypoglossal. That is motor only to the tongue, associated with mostly speech and some swallowing. Swallowing is kind of shared amongst a couple different cranial nerves as well, because swallowing requires your tongue to be pushed up toward the roof of your mouth to push food to the back part of your throat. And then we have what's called stylopharyngeus. It's a muscle in the back of the throat that has to contract and pull back to create a cavity, so to speak, to behind the tongue, so that food can, enter into the tube of your throat and then down into your esophagus. So there are multiple nerves associated with swallowing, hypoglossal because it innervates the skeletal muscles of the tongue. The tongue has to elevate and push food back, but it's mostly think speech. Glossopharyngeal is going to have something to do with it also with swallowing, but vagus is big time associated with swallowing. Okay, so accessory nerve or spinal accessory is motor to sternocleidomastoid and trapezius for moving in the head and shoulders, like shrugging your shoulders. And hypoglossal is motor to the tongue, only the tongue, for mostly speech and a little bit of swallowing. Now we need to go back to 9 and 10 now. So 9 and 10 cover a lot of territory. Glossopharyngeal is tongue and part of the throat because that's what the pharynx is. And vagus nerve covers a lot of territory, a lot of the motor in the throat as well. And vagus nerve is the only sensory and motor supply to structures below the shoulders, like within the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavity. That's a lot of territory. So these two are rather complicated, and they share some of the same functions as, let's say, facial does as well, because of their sensory components. So glossopharyngeal, sensory component. This conveys taste from the posterior third of your tongue. So facial is the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, taste. Glossopharyngeal is the posterior third of the tongue. It also conveys the sensation of touch and temperature and pressure from the surface of the pharynx, which is the back part of the throat. It also carries sensory information from the carotid arteries. So we said in the carotid arteries, we have not only chemoreceptors, but baroreceptors. So the baroreceptors there are conveying information about blood pressure, and the chemoreceptors are conveying information about gas levels like oxygen and carbon dioxide, levels of the blood that are passing through those carotid arteries. And those carotid arteries are in the throat area. That's where you take a carotid pulse. All right. So glossopharyngeal, taste, surface of the pharynx, and blood pressure and blood gas levels from the carotid arteries. The motor component, it elevates the pharynx. It is that particular, what's called the stylopharyngeus muscle. When it contracts, it elevates the pharynx. And it's also motor to the parotid glands, and the parotid glands secrete saliva, so associated with digestion. Did someone have a question? Anybody have a question? Okay. So we're going to see kind of how glossopharyngeal and now vagus kind of overlap a little bit. So now we move around to vagus, baby. This is cranial nerve 10. And look, only one to extend past the shoulders. Right? So it's everything, the sensory and motor to any of the organs in the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, all of those organs, it's all on vagus, baby. All right, so sensory, we're going to finish taste here. It conveys taste from the epiglottis, which is farther down in what's called the laryngopharynx. It's the entrance point to the larynx and to the esophagus. So taste, when we look at taste and special senses, is going to be conveyed on 3 cranial nerves, 7, 9, and 10. 7 to the anterior 2/3, cranial nerve 9 to the posterior third, and vagus from the epiglottis and that lower part of the pharynx. It too monitors and conveys sensory information about blood pressure and blood gas levels, but not from the carotid arteries, from the aortic arch. The aorta is the first branch off the left, or it's the only vessel off, conveying blood from your left ventricle of your heart. So it's a large, very large artery, thick muscular wall. So the aortic arch, and that is in the thoracic cavity. It conveys visceral sensations from the organs in the thorax and the abdomen, all below the shoulders. It also has a motor component. A lot of the muscles in the throat, in the pharynx, most of them are going to be innervated by the vagus nerve. Up to the upper part, more level with the tongue, is a little more glossopharyngeal, but the rest of that pharynx, it's like trying to squeeze down and squeeze, a balloon, down. Is that you need to it's going to be muscles that are kind of circular muscles that will contract and kind of what's called peristaltically push food down toward your esophagus. So it's associated with swallowing, gagging. We're going to talk about that gag reflex in just a second. Coughing, all that comes from, or just above your larynx, your voice box, that lower part, what's called the laryngopharynx. Voice production, which is in the pharynx. Peristalsis, which is the movement, the coordinated movement of circular and longitudinal muscles pushing food down the esophagus to the stomach, down through the small intestine and large intestine, and out the other end of your butt. That's called peristalsis. It also acts on the heart to slow down heart rate. It slows down the heart. Vagus nerve is the only one to innervate any of those structures that are found in the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities, period. There are reflexes that you're going to do later when you get into nursing or maybe PA school or nurse practitioner. I guess they probably do that a little bit more there. Is when, and most people have experienced this. You go to get a physical and they do all the tapping of things. So we're going to talk about some of those reflexes. They tap on the tendons to get the muscle to contract, but they also examine your head and neck area. They use a little pen light to flash into your eyes to look for pupillary constriction, which will be oculomotor and part of the parasympathetic division. They often use a sharp and dull touch areas of the skin of your face. So you're testing the sensation or the right and left sensory components of the trigeminal nerve. They'll ask you to smile, frown, open your mouth. Those are muscles associated with facial expression, a motor component of the facial nerve. Let's say open your mouth and say, ah. You're looking for the uvula, that little piece of tissue that hangs down like a V from the roof of your mouth. Right? When stylopharyngeus contracts and you say, ah, it elevates the back of your throat, and that uvula should go straight up and stay midline and back. Right? That's testing the motor component of glossopharyngeal. And then they'll often take a tongue depressor and they'll go, okay, say, and they'll press down your tongue and they'll go to the back and they stroke the back of your tongue, which makes you, it's a gag reflex. That's, what you want to elicit. So in doing so, to even feel the tongue depressor on the back of the throat is part of the sensory component of glossopharyngeal. And that gagging reflex is the motor component of vagus. So now you kind of start to put together what these different reflexes, things that you've already experienced, going to have physical examinations done, either as a kid or even as an adult. When you get into these programs, you have to go get another physical exam, I'm telling you, and you have to keep up with all your vaccinations and document them all. That's something you can kind of, if you're, start working on now, is if you haven't had some of these vaccinations, you might as well get them. You have to have Hep B. It's a 2 or 3 vaccination series. I forgot. Yeah, it's a 3. Put all your records together so that you can then submit them, and I'll tell you, you will be on top of your game, when it comes to getting that nursing program, because they give you about 2 or 3 weeks to get it all done. And everybody starts pulling their hair out. So, when in doubt, over this break, over summer, start putting some of that stuff together, because it will start rocking and rolling really quick. When you have to get that information together. And now that we're getting different vaccines and things, have an envelope or hopefully a safe fireproof box or something that you keep all that material in, because you will need it really quickly. Okay, so those are our cranial nerves. They're sensory or motor functions or both. This kind of gives you an idea of where these are located on the inferior surface of the brain. I know right now you guys are still working on muscles, but this is a handy one to use to identify, the different cranial nerves. All right. And this, I just say, I include this because you can see how much vagus nerve does. I mean, it is the only sensory or motor to not only things within the throat, in the cervical area, in the larynx, in the what's called the laryngopharynx, just above the larynx, but the esophagus and everything within your chest and your abdomen. I mean, it's huge. so it describes its functions. The only thing that is not labeled correctly here, is to convey, the sensory information from the carotid arteries. That is going to be glossopharyngeal, and it tells that later in the chapter when it comes to the respiratory system. I think, it talks about that and it labels it correctly. Okay, so now we're going to talk about reflexes, and briefly the difference just between a spinal reflex and an autonomic reflex. But we don't really know what the autonomic system is, so it's a little harder to put meaning to that until we cover that. But reflexes like this, spinal reflexes, are rapid, predictable motor responses to a particular stimulus. They are unlearned, unpremeditated, and involuntary. Involuntary. There are 5 components to a reflex arc, and this will match really well with a lot of the models downstairs. We have some really good ones. So it starts with a receptor. You have to have some kind of a structure that detects some kind of change in the environment. Otherwise, what's the point, right? So the receptor will trigger an action potential in a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron transmits the impulse to the central nervous system, as always. It will often synapse in the posterior horn, or the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord, with an association or an interneuron. And that's part of what's called the integration center. It then transmits an impulse not very far, but to the anterior gray horn, to the motor neuron cell body there, onto its dendrites. And then that brings a motor neuron to threshold, and it conveys an action potential all the way down the length of that neuron to the effector. And the effector is either the muscle or gland that is at the terminal end of that motor neuron. In most of these cases, we're going to be looking at muscles, but it could be a muscle or a gland, technically. All right, so here we have a picture. We start in the skin, and this is pretty good because we have our 5 components: receptor, sensory neuron, integration center. I just call that the association or interneuron because it labels it as such, and then the motor neuron and the effector. And in most cases, they're going to show you a skeletal muscle. So we start with some kind of stimulus. In this case, it happens to be, wow, a nail being driven into someone's skin, or they probably stepped on it. And that stimulates maybe a free nerve ending, right? So that brings the blue neuron, a sensory neuron, carries an action potential to the central nervous system. Right? And where the little fork is at the end of that sensory neuron represents the axon terminals. So now we have a synapse between the sensory neuron and the interneuron in green. That little green knob represents the cell body of an interneuron or an association neuron. It carries the impulse to the anterior gray horn, where it too forks and synapses with the red ball of which represents the motor neuron cell body. And the motor neuron carries the impulse away from the spinal cord to the effector. This gives you a good idea of what we were saying. If blue is a sensory neuron, it's a unipolar shape. All these sensory neurons from general body sensation are unipolar in their shape. That's good to know. Their cell bodies are in a cluster. So where you have that one little blue knob there, picture many of them there. That is the dorsal root ganglion. Then we synapse with, so the cell bodies of sensory neurons are found in the dorsal root ganglion. Synapses with an interneuron, the posterior gray horn. Thus, the cell bodies of an interneuron or an association neuron are found here, the green ball, in the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Then a synapse with a motor neuron whose cell bodies, the red knob, are found in the anterior or ventral gray horn. And then it conveys the impulse, away from the spinal cord to an effector. They love to ask questions about that in lab by using, maybe even the model like this. I ask similar questions in lecture. All right, reflex examples. Well, we have spinal reflexes and autonomic reflexes. The spinal are always considered the somatic, meaning general body. Mm. So the effector is always skeletal muscle. And we have different ones. We have stretch receptors, tendon receptors, flexor reflexes, cross extensor reflexes. Reflexes are rather complicated, and it may involve just ipsilateral, like same size structures, side muscles, or it may include flexion on one side and extension of muscles on the other side so you don't fall over. That's what a cross extensor is. Spinal or autonomic reflexes are reflexes that affect all the autonomic organs, like cardiac, heart, smooth muscles of the eye, of the pupils, pupillary constriction, pupillary dilation, different glands, micturition, which is urination. That's a reflex. Once the bladder extends, and gets stretched, those muscles there send signals. They have receptors there that then are controlled by the parasympathetic division to then stimulate those muscles there to contract and expel urine. All right, so a stretch reflex. We have two types we're going to look at, which are the basic ones: a stretch reflex and a Golgi tendon reflex. And they work in opposition to one another. So a stretch reflex, our receptor is what's called a muscle spindle. And even though you're studying muscles right now, picture like a biceps brachii, because that's the one you mostly picture. Although when you do the patellar reflex, most people remember getting hit with a reflex hammer below their kneecap and getting their knee to jerk. But the biceps one is pretty easy. So you have your biceps brachii, anterior aspect of the humerus. And sort of in the middle, in the belly part, the middle of that muscle, we have these muscle spindles. And it kind of looks like a slinky, kind of stretched out slinky. If you remember what a slinky is, I'm way older than you guys are, but it's kind of a coil of wire that you can play with. All right. So when we perform a stretch reflex, we're going to try to stretch the muscle, pull that slinky apart as quickly as possible. Over lengthening or stretching of a muscle like that causes the muscle to contract in response. Right. So what you do is you traction down on the biceps tendon there just above the elbow joint. Right. And then you have the person relax and look away, and you tap on your thumb to pull on the tendon, which pulls on the middle part of the, the interior part of the muscle, and it pulls that slinky apart and stretches it. And because the body doesn't know how long you're going to be stretching it, when you do a quick rapid tap like that, the response is to compensate and contract. Right? So we use that same kind of stretch reflex in biceps brachii. You can do it to your triceps brachii. You can do it brachioradialis. Oh, you don't know what that is because we don't make you know that. To the patellar tendon, or that is where the common insertion of your quadriceps, or for gastrocnemius and soleus that attach to your calcaneus, that would be your Achilles tendon. Right. So you can tap on these areas and cause those muscles to contract, and they're graded from 1 to 5, or like 0 to 4 or 5. I can't quite remember, but you either have a normal response, you have, maybe hyperreflexia, transient clonus, sustained clonus, you have normal, then you have diminished contraction, or like no contraction whatsoever. So there's ways to grade all these. Reciprocal, antagonistic muscles on the opposite side of the muscle that you're testing will have a stimulus that travels to them to inhibit them, to keep them relaxed. And this will make sense. Thus, that's called reciprocal inhibition, when action potential stimulates contraction in one muscle and inhibits the opposite or antagonistic muscle. This is elicited by tapping on a tendon quickly with a reflex hammer. Right, so let me just go back. Let's use the biceps brachii. We traction on the tendon. You hit it with one of those, reflex hammers. You want to see biceps brachii to contract. So you send an excitatory stimulus on the nerves that supply biceps brachii. But at the same time, what you need to do is send an inhibitory keeps the triceps brachii muscle from contracting, because if biceps and triceps work in opposition to each other and they both contract, then nothing's going to happen, right? So you want to contract biceps brachii, the agonist, and inhibit the opposition muscle, the antagonist. And the effect of that neurotransmitter is going to hyperpolarize in an action potential that particular muscle. So it's called reciprocal inhibition. This is one way where you can get maybe a spasmed muscle to relax. Let's say you have a spasm. All right, we're just going to use the arms again. The triceps brachii muscle is spasming. If you make your biceps brachii muscle work and you lift weights or you put some kind of resistance to it, for biceps to contract, it needs to send an inhibitory signal to triceps brachii or any antagonistic muscles. And in doing so, it can kind of help it relax a little bit, and then you can stretch the muscle and then again stimulate biceps brachii so that you have an inhibitory signal traveling to the triceps brachii or whichever muscle you're trying to relax. Reciprocal inhibition. This just shows you that loop. You can look at that on your own because that's essentially what I'm telling you. Right here, they're doing a patella, tendon reflex. So you want to see the quadriceps muscles contract and bend the knee, extend the knee and kick forward. And to do that, we must inhibit the hamstrings, right? Because the hamstrings flex the knee. Quadriceps extend that knee. So you can look at that loop there. We're not going to spend too much time, but I will say in the upper left-hand corner, you see that muscle there. Do you see inside? That's what, if you can make that a little bit bigger, it kind of looks like a slinky in there, and when that gets stretched, that is the receptor that then sends a sensor, along a signal on the sensory neuron to the spinal cord, to maybe an interneuron to the motor neuron, to then travel back out to the same muscle that contains that sensory receptor that's being stimulated, for that muscle to contract and the antagonistic muscle to be inhibited. A Golgi tendon reflex is the opposite, right? Now, in a Golgi tendon reflex, we're stimulating these receptors that are in the tendons. And it responds to over contraction of the muscle involved. So before, we were creating what's called a quick stretch, stretching a muscle so that you get it to contract. Now what we're going to do is simulate over contraction so that the response should be to let it relax the muscle you're testing. So the Golgi tendon organ, called the GTO, is a receptor that responds when extraordinary tension or pulling is placed on that tendon. And that extraordinary tension or pulling is created when the muscle is over contracting, in red there. As a result, what is the stimulus? Well, the stimulus is created to inhibit and relax the involved muscle. And the stimulus to the antagonistic muscle will be to contract, exactly the opposite of what we did before. So now we will have reciprocal antagonistic muscle activation. Right? So as a result, the tendon reflexes causes the muscle you're testing to relax and the antagonistic muscle to contract, just the opposite of what we did before. Stretch and tendon reflexes work together, or work against each other, I should say, to keep muscles in tone and maintain posture. We said before when we're talking about muscles that they're often in pairs that work in opposition to one another. Biceps versus triceps, abdominal muscles versus your erector spinae. Hamstrings versus quadriceps, tibialis anterior, versus, tibialis posterior, and your gastrocnemius and soleus muscles. All right, so this just kind of shows you that same loop. If we stretch the tendon, right, we do have a tendon organ that's stimulated, then it carries on the blue sensory neuron to the spinal cord. We have an interneuron in green to the motor neurons. Okay, the red one, right, is carrying an inhibitory stimulus to the muscle that you're testing, so it relaxes, and an excitatory on the purple or dark blue, I guess that's purple, to the hamstring, the antagonistic muscle. And you know which are excitatory, inhibitory by those pluses and minuses next to the motor neuron cell bodies right there in the anterior gray horn. So that's where you know. And down in the lower hand side, it says, hey, a plus means excitatory synapse and a negative sign means an inhibitory synapse. And that takes us to our Kahooty Doody. And then we should be done. All right, so I'm gonna change my share. Last Kahooty Doody for the night, you guys. And then we are done till next week, our next lecture. All right, we're gonna get crack-a-lacking because we're getting about to the end of our lecture period. Very good. I think that Tasha doesn't realize that when she signed in, she didn't get automatically muted because that's not my house making the noises. I don't, although the dogs would be if they were here with me. Oh, yeah, she heard that. Thanks, Natasha. It's okay. They're not really loud at all. Okay, it's 3, 4, and 6. I know we just covered all this, so you know it's kind of a lot. But you know later, after you start getting into this a little bit with the brain, or maybe the next time, I don't want to overload you with too much stuff because you're just really finishing up the muscles and getting that exam. But there's ways in which if you start tackling this now, and I know you're worried about your other lab practical, is start to review and at least start to memorize the names of the neurons, the cranial nerves 1 through 12. Start with 1 through 6 and then 7 through 12. 1 through 6, get online, find mnemonics. There's a ton of them out there. Some of them are a little dirty and naughty, but you know, you remember those, everybody does. So, and at least just start tackling that, because then when you you do that for about 2 days, then you add another layer to it, another layer to it. It's not so overwhelming. When I teach lab, I do this, when we just look at the brain structures, and instead of waiting till we get to the peripheral nervous system, I at least have you naming and identifying each nerve on the brain model and what their names are. Not any sensory or motor functions or anything that will come later. But if you do it a little bit at a time, it's so much easier, I'm just telling you. And in the process of them putting their sensory and motor together, it's helpful to have maybe a couple flashcards for those that you can cluster together like this. Like the cranial nerves associated with eye movement are 3, 3, 4, and 6. The ones associated with taste, is 7, 9, and 10. The ones associated with blood pressure and blood gas levels, 9 and 10. So, you start to then, now that you've looked at them all individually, because it gets a little confusing, you find what is common to them. And then you go, okay, I'm not going crazy because I know these are similar. And then eventually we'll be like, well, which cranial nerves associated with parasympathetic functions? Because cranial, some of the cranial nerves are part of the parasympathetic division, not the sympathetic division. They will be 3, 7, 9, and 10. So it's just the beginning. Good. All righty. All right, nicely done. All right, let me close that out real quick. Get out of there. All right, yep, that is the end. That was pretty certain. So we'll terminate this Zoom meeting in just a moment. I was going to just mention that for those of you anybody that just logged in, we have created separate Zooms and videos for the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system, because that was on our schedule to cover this evening. We are already now, as far as lecture, halfway through, if not more, of the exam 3 material. Yay! All right, so although we're ahead of lab right now, there's a whole chapter on the autonomic nervous system that there is no lab that corresponds with it. And there's a lot in that is really relevant and really important for nurses. We are going to spend at least one whole night working on that, and then special senses is just another class meeting, and that will coincide really tightly with when your special senses lab. But autonomic nervous system doesn't have a lab to go with it, so it's a little more difficult to visualize, and there's a good amount of information in there. So that's why we need to kind of get ahead a little bit. Does anybody have any particular questions? Exam 2 is open for review, so you can go in there. For those people who who were not part of the Zoom for CNS or at the beginning of it, I sent out an email about the SSI, a couple extra points on an exam, not your lowest one because that gets dropped, for participating in the SSI. Take a snapshot of that end message that says thanks for submitting your survey. It doesn't tell me what you put in there. It doesn't give me any information. It just on your course page, it'll you just take that picture, attach it to an email within the course page from the communications tab, and do not remove anything from the subject line. Don't even put anything in there. Just attach take the photo or pic and attach it, or embed it in the email and just send it to me. Don't even put your name or anything. I already know your name. It's on there, and your course number and section number is on there as well, and that's all you have to do. You say whatever you want, but there's no way I can track what it is, or what you said, so hopefully you said something nice. And if you are going to say something nice, Often students will either, well, they either love you or you hate you, but, if you do like what's being done, maybe put something in there like what you do like about it. What I think is really helpful to put in, and they've been surveying students, is I think, especially right now when we're coming back to, face-to-face classes, is I personally think that our success rates have gone up in these classes because we have a mixed medium. Not necessarily this particular summer class, but last semester I had it where you could either attend face-to-face, or I would, in the classroom, record it like this, you'd live Zoom it from home, and that gave you this flexibility. I think that helped a lot with people who had unexpected turmoil maybe in their life, that, just because you can't come and be face-to-face doesn't mean you can't attend somehow, or do you like the fact that you have, quizzes every week, or I don't know, say something that you like, and if there's something you don't like, then say, hey, I didn't like the way this had to be all online, I can't wait to be face-to-face, then, that's fine, because hopefully we'll have a blended classes like that give you the options. And I think, this is just my opinion, I think that's the best of both worlds, because you can come and attend when you want to and when you can, but if your kids get sick or your car breaks down or something, you can attend from home, or if you're unemployed and you get a job, or whatever, or your hours change at work, you're not knocked out of it. You can at least watch the Zoom, and the recorded lecture. So, anything you're feeling right now about the COVID restrictions, whatever, put something in there. All right. So, if anybody has a question, just unmicrophone yourself.
We definitely don't have class the 5th, right?
What does it say on the, I didn't look at next week yet. I'm still only on this week.
Okay. I don't think we do. I'm just making sure, because I'll be in New York.
I'm going to New York. Did I tell you I'm going over Thanksgiving?
Oh, really?
I'm going to the Thanksgiving Day parade. I'm from New York and I've never been to the darn parade.
I haven't either.
So I just bought sub-zero weather clothing and things because I'm a wussy in the cold, at least now that I live in Florida. But anyway, well, if not, don't worry, because it will be Zoomed.
Okay.
So I just have to look at that. I know we don't have an examination of any kind. I mean, you have a couple quizzes that are due this Sunday, I believe.
Yeah.
Or did I make it? I might have made it for Monday, actually.
Maybe. I don't know.
See, I think I figured 4th of July is on Sunday, right? And I think I might have made it due on Monday because no one's probably going to get it. You can get it done early. They're all open. There's no excuse not to get quizzes done. They've been open since the beginning of the semester. It's the exams that and still you have a week to get the exam done. So right. I'll take a look-see at that. I think we're considered closed, and that might be why.
Okay.
But at least the quizzes could be due then, so you don't let it get too far away.
Right. Yeah, I'm good with that.
Good. Good question. But even if you're remote, even if I had a lecture and you weren't there, you don't have to. You've been here every single week. You just maybe watch the recorded Zoom that would be uploaded.
Okay, thanks.
All right, good question. Make sure you get that SSI done before you go, because you'll forget.
I just did it.
Okay, good. Remember, everybody, that's due July 11th. It's open until the end of the semester, but my deadline is July 11th, because then it's like mayhem at the end of the semester doing final grades. All righty then. Well, have a good weekend. I'm going to stop the recording and I will see you guys next week. Have a safe holiday, and make sure you take care of your pets so they don't get loose and run away, because that happens all the time.
Bye.
Right. Bye.